itself is impressive enough, but in addition to her work with corporate, commercial, international banking, and in the financial services editor, Shola also is a political and women's rights activist, a commentator. I'm sure most of you have seen her in the mornings and on Sky. Definitely often getting the last word in. In addition to that, she founded the Women in Leadership publication, a platform to drive positive change on topical issues that impact women globally through inspiring personal leadership journeys. A lot of the work that Shola does on diversity is within that intersectionality of diversity, inclusion, and misogyny. So it's difficult work, and we are definitely very grateful for it. Marcus Ryder Mbe is known for his work in increasing diversity and representation in the UK media industry. He coordinated the campaign for film and television diversity tax breaks to increase the representation of women, ethnic minorities, and disabled people. Marcus works within the film and television industry and is backed by major industry figures such as Selene Henry, Mira Ciel, and Adrian Lester OBE currently. Now, Marcus, I'm going to mangle this because I have never worked in your part of the world, but it's the Cation Global. You're the executive producer there, which is China's leading independent financial publication. Prior to this, you held many award-winning roles within the TV industry, including the most recent role as the head of current affairs at BBC Scotland. Your blog, the Black on White TV blog, examines issues of race and diversity in British television and across the media. Your bios themselves are a mouthful, so welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of this conversation. So it's really, I think, serendipitous and important that we are speaking as we await the results of the US election, because this is an election in which race and the representations of race and the reportage on race has really helped to frame the conversation, both politically and within the TV industry covering this, but also politically within the understanding of what the outcome of this race would be. And obviously, first and foremost, I have to add the proviso that although between us we have decades of experience in this industry as people of color, obviously we do not speak for every person of color or Black person within the industry, but we have had an overview of many of the experiences, not only our own experiences, but of those coming up behind us. And especially for you, Marcus, and you, Shola, you very much play a mentoring role. And so you do have an overview not only of what has happened in your time, but what is coming down the road. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations. My first question to both of you is really within that context of what we've seen play out through the coverage of the US election. A big part of what we do as journalists and what we are encouraged to do is to bring our experience to the table, our experience of these stories. It is from that we glean authority. However, as people of color within the industry, it is often difficult to feel that you can bring your lived experience, which is the prism through which a lot of these key issues, through which your understanding of them is filtered. I think for so many people, after the 2016 elections, it definitely felt like many of those colleagues of color in the US were quicker to understand that much of the voting for Trump, the support of Trump, was built around race. Even as other commentators spoke about economic anxiety, it seemed like it was something that those of us who had a lived experience of racism seemed to get to much quicker. And yet, when colleagues do speak from that lived experience, whether it's as migrant women coming from countries that are authoritarian, or as a Black British man who has had an uncomfortable experience with policing and with authority, it feels like you're being inobjective. So my question is, both of you have been able to overcome that self-censorship, or even that broader censorship about those fears around objectivity. And you both speak really eloquently about the importance of speaking from our lived experience in these newsrooms. So I'm going to start with you, Shola. How do you find that confidence, and why do you think that confidence to speak from lived experience is so important?
That's a great question. And I think it's important for us all to understand that it's not necessarily about finding the confidence. It's about understanding your truth and your authenticity. I think that we all get to a point in our life when we just go, I don't give a rat's ass anymore. You know what? I'm done. I'm just done. I'm seriously, you get to a point where you go, right, this has gotten to a point where my voice and my power of expression is being silenced. It's almost like the expertise that can be drawn from my experience doesn't fit the narrative. And what is the narrative? The narrative is always centering whiteness into everything, centers whiteness into what is professional, centers whiteness into what is partial or impartial, centers whiteness into what the angle of the story is. No, hold up a second. I feel like Black people and people of color say, my story is not up for debate. So you can benefit from our lived experience. And I understand the whole thing about, platforms needing to have some kind of sense of, well, we're only reporting the news as it presents itself. But sometimes, and this is what 2020 has done. 2020 has blown the lid off the whole you can only tell stories this way, you can only report this way. I remember the whole issue with the BBC and Naga Mochenti when she was talking about racism and then she was denounced for it. That made no sense. You're talking to an Asian woman, she should be able to say what she knows racism is. She's not denying whatever experience you claim to have or not have. And I think that this year has made it much more possible. It's not the year per se, it is the fact that I think many people have gotten to the point where silence is no longer acceptable. So it's not about finding the confidence, it's about being that voice you need to be. And the problem is, if we do not speak from our authentic selves, it means that millions of other people who have the same thing to share don't have that platform. So this is my view, right? Because life is too short. You only have one life to live. And so if I'm going to be speaking on any platform, I always say to people, I'm going to be speaking true, right? They go, oh yeah, but Dr. Shah, there's no buts. If you're going to have me on this platform, I will tell you exactly what's on my mind. If there's something I get wrong, I'll tell you I got it wrong. I don't claim to know more than I know, but I will break it down for you in a way that you should understand. And if you can't handle my power of expression, my power of opinion, and the power of authenticity that the good Lord gave you, you better just get the heck out of my lane. It's really simple.
Marcus, the same question to you. How and why?
I think that there are a few things we need to unpick. There's the idea that we need to talk from our lived experience, and people normally interpret that as talking about racism or talking about how the world affects us. And, the Nagaman Chetty is a very good example of that, of her personally drawing on her experience. And then, to be honest with you, there's just drawing on your perspective. My perspective as to how the editorial priorities that I have, right, are not necessarily about racism, right? And it's really wrong. And when I've had these discussions before, people constantly want to talk about racism, right? I don't necessarily want to talk about racism. I mean, don't get me wrong, that is a lived experience, and that is a story that needs to be covered, right? But whether I think, if there are two earthquakes, and one is in one part of Asia, and one is in one part of Africa, right? As an editorial lead, I've got to decide which is my editorial priority here. And I will have a different perspective, right? If there's a COVID-19 story, and one is about BAME suffering more, and one is about a lockdown in another part of the country, what's going to be my lead, right? And so it's about making sure that everybody has, even if we have the same views on impartiality, which we can go into later, which I don't think we do, but even if we did, right? An editor still needs to have priorities. And the reality is that depending on your perspective, depending on your values, depending on your experiences, you will have different experiences, right? And that will give you different editorial values. And so what this is about is that if you have a room full of white men, right, who have very similar experiences, their editorial priorities and choices, right, will shape the news that they produce and shape the news that they commission and the stories that they want told and how they want them told, versus if you have a room full of Black women, right? And so it's just making sure that so when you say, how did I become brave to speak out? It's not about that. I mean, we can talk about that, but for me, it's almost not about that. It's making sure that I stay true to the values that I have as to what do I think are the editorial priorities that are of the stories that need to be told. Invariably, if as Black people working in news and journalism, if this is what's really sad, if we want to progress, what we do is that we actually learn the editorial values and priorities of somebody else, right? We get culturalized, right, within a newsroom, and we learn that the earthquake in Germany is going to be, I don't know if they have earthquakes in Germany, but the earthquake in Germany,
the event in Germany.
The event in Germany is going to be more important than the event in Sudan, right? So we actually learn what our bosses think or the newsroom culture thinks are going to be the editorial priorities, right? And it does take courage. This is where I do agree with you, Nima. It does take courage to say, I don't know if that actually is the editorial priority that we should be going with. I think possibly the event in Sudan might be more important than the event in Germany. You know, so that's what does take courage, is making sure that, and it's not even courage, that culturalization, right, happens quite naturally, right? You almost have to be sociopathic to be working in a newsroom day in, day out, and not take on the values of that newsroom, right? And so the hard part is that even as a Black person, because often they say, well, if we get a Black person in a position of authority, if we get, people always talk about change the gatekeepers, right? If you only have one gatekeeper, the process of getting that gatekeeper there, right? As I said, unless they're sociopathic, right? If they have worked through a newsroom for years to get there, they will end up with the same values, right, as the people around them. So what we actually need to do is form critical masses, right, of news in newsrooms, so that we actually change the culture. So it's not just one person, or it's just not two people. And then their priorities can actually come through in different newsrooms.
No, I think that's a fantastic point. Sorry,
I'm just going to quickly add, I really like the points you raised, Marcus, especially around the perspective, because it's so true. And this is not unique to the media industry. It's the same in the legal industry. You become, culturalized, as you say, from a junior position all the way to a senior position. And that is where I find authenticity comes in, that you must always be true to yourself, even as you're growing and you're learning and you're developing and your trajectory is going on. I remember, and I'm using this as an example, I remember sitting in a meeting full of senior stakeholders, the heads of business, as an in-house lawyer, and one of the business heads said, they were talking about businesses they want to bring on board. This was in a bank, and one of the relationship managers was really excited about this piece of business he's bringing in, and then he goes on to say, because he said, "Listen, this is going to be a really big client coming from Africa. I'm talking about deep, dark Africa." Now, everybody in that room was much more senior than I am, or at the time. But I remember I didn't even think about it. I turned to him and I went, deep, dark Africa. You know, I'm Nigerian, so my body language is an entire language of expression. I didn't need to say anything else, because the overall head of business came to apologize to me. The man himself sent me an email apologizing that he did not, because people get used to certain, colloquial words that they use in business, right? Which is, I think, part of what you're talking about how people just assimilate certain things and certain behaviors and choices. But I remember my manager at the time, who wasn't at the meeting, getting a call from the overall head of business saying, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry, I hope we didn't offend Shola." And when she was told what happened, she laughed and she said, "Oh, Shola is not like that. She doesn't get offended over things like that." And then she comes over to tell me what happened, that she just had a chat. And I went, "No, that was wrong. First of all, there's nothing deep, dark about Africa. We've got way more sun than you guys." And she went, "Oh, okay." But the point is, the truth of the matter is, anytime we talk about Black people and ethnic minorities, we're not talking about perspective of racism. Not only unless it is particularly relevant, unless, of course, we're talking about privilege, all kinds of things. But as a woman, for instance, if you have a journalist, a broadcaster, giving an opinion about something to do with women's rights or something relatable, or even the economy, I find that we should be able to bring that perspective into the report, into the story, because we have an invested interest. So I would say that from your point, Marcus, that the industry needs to invest in the expertise, not just the professional expertise, but the personal expertise. Even think about the
lived experience.
Example, right? If you have somebody who lives in that country or who has lived in that country, who has, who's experienced earthquakes, and the person who's reporting it, they should be able to say ABC without feeling that their opinion is going to be cut off.
Also, without feeling like they're and especially as a Black woman, that you're the awkward, angry Black lady. That you're always the person with your hand up at the back. And that goes back to, Marcus, your point about, it's not just about one Black person as a gatekeeper or one person of color as a gatekeeper. It's about allies who amplify the voices of people of color in the newsroom. But it's also having a critical mass of people with different perspectives, because of course we're not homogenous. My perspective on authority, Marcus, is probably going to be different to yours because I grew up in a country without systems. And that was, again, in the time of the rise of the populist movement, that was something that was really interesting to me, is I immediately recognized the language that President Trump was using.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nima.
No, go ahead.
So that's a really interesting view. So, for example, my wife is Kenyan, and so many times when you look at when people have talked about the rise of Trump or populism, right, they invariably frame it, right, with regards to the rise of the far right before World War II, right? You hear those parallels all the time. I'm not saying I agree with them, but I'm just saying that's a perspective that you often hear with regards to using the far right and what led up to World War II and Nazi Germany when you talk about populism, right? And when I talk to my wife, who grew up in Kenya, and when I speak to other people, they feel that the rise in the breakdown in certain democratic institutions, right? They much prefer to look at what happened with regards to South America and what's happened in some parts of Africa, and they feel that there are parallels which are far more important, right? And so again, even if we're not reporting about racism at all, and I have to stress this because invariably when I've had these conversations, they always go back to, well, it was a story about sexism, they didn't have a woman on it. It was a story about racism, they didn't have a Black person on it. This is important. I don't disagree at all. But what's also important is that we have really important perspectives on things which will be different to our white colleagues, which on the face of it have nothing to do with sexism, nothing to do with racism, right? But at different perspectives will mean that we can see the story differently. We will draw on different examples, right? That the one with regards to the rise in populism and the example that you just gave with regards to how you saw it through a different prism growing up in, I think it's Sudan, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the fact that you all see it differently, that hasn't necessarily got anything to do with racism per se. It's not immediately obvious. And that's what I just have to keep stressing, because what I don't want is for us to be pigeonholed in terms of, oh, this is a race story. Yeah. It's really important we get a Black perspective. No, this might be a story about food poisoning in Hertfordshire.
Yes.
Right? It's really important that we actually get a Black perspective. And we might never talk about Black people at all when we talk about the food poisoning in Hertfordshire. But I will have a different perspective on food poisoning in Hertfordshire.
Absolutely.
I don't know if there is any food poisoning in Hertfordshire again. Let's not
besmirch the good name of the people in Hertfordshire. Let's just get that one out. But I think it is such a, we were nominated for 3 Emmys this year, 3, 4, I can't remember. We were nominated the year before and the year before that. We have never won an Emmy for any of our reporting. And because this year the Emmy ceremony was virtual, so they divided up the night. So the Spanish language Emmys were on a different night. I was able for the first time to see very clearly how white the winners were. And not just how white, that the black, the non-white people who won, to your point, Marcus, because I think it's an excellent point, won for journalism that was focused on race. So the Oprah Winfrey Network won about a mother's perspective on the conversation around how you deal with police. There was another, one of my amazing colleagues, Victor Blackwell, won for his conversation about, for the off-the-cuff comments he made about Baltimore after President Trump called it cockroach infested. And that's very important work. But it felt to me as a foreign correspondent that we'd been that we were almost being sent a very clear and specific message, which is stay in your lane. You know, we will reward you for your reportage on issues that are Black focused or affect non-white communities. But other than that, we're not interested in seeing you report in these places. And that's something that you have actually spoken about and written about really eloquently, Marcus, which is this idea about watching world news through white eyes, that centering of the white gaze whenever we are reporting on foreign affairs, and the danger of that. Can you talk a little bit about why you feel that it's so important to branch out from that white gaze?
Well, I felt I got this firsthand, and this was an ongoing debate, not about race, but when I was head of current affairs in Scotland for BBC. I was head of BBC's current affairs in Scotland. And the ongoing debate there was Scottish people did not want a constant London-centric gaze, you know. They felt it was really important, and I felt it was really important, to make sure that we viewed the world through a Scottish lens. You know, so it's when you've actually gone working in Scotland for 8 years and recognizing how London-centric the gaze was really important for me. And then it held lessons to realizing that we need to look at how we look at the world, not just through a Scottish gaze, but through, you know, make sure that we have different gender perspectives, different disability perspectives, different ability perspectives. So that really, even though obviously I've been working in diversity and I've been a Black journalist ever since I became a journalist, but seeing a very sophisticated debate that was going on in Scotland about this. And in many ways, even though what we're doing is great and 2020 is great, it's opening up these discussions, the level of sophistication of the debate when I was in Scotland was tremendous. And I've drawn on that a lot when I've been looking and trying to analyze seeing the world through a white gaze. And you realize that we do. I mean, I'm in Malaysia right now because I'm actually stuck here because of COVID. I work out of China normally. And you see all the foreign correspondents, and nearly all of them, in fact, I would say all of them, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head.
I am as well, actually.
You know, I think all of the, when I'm talking to the BBC, when I talk to the former BBC colleagues, I look at New York Times, I look at the FT, I'm just thinking of like journalist friends that I have, Bloomberg, I think they're all white, you know, and that
unless they're based in the region. Sometimes they, like the New York Times does have Syrian correspondents based out of the Middle East, but a lot of that is also about access. You know, it's if you can't get into a place, then you are, fortunately, for the people of that country, forced to use local journalists, regional journalists.
And a lot of the time, what those, but then you also have to look at the power dynamics of those local journalists and their editors back home as well. Because what's often happening then is you then get the editorial priorities, and the stories which are commissioned are stories which are commissioned back at base, in be that London, be that DC, New York, wherever it is, right? And then what they're doing is asking a stringer or a far junior person to then report on a story which they have felt is important, you know, back home rather. So you also got to look at power dynamics as well.
No, that's a very valid point. Shola, it's also very rare to see just opinionated women on television in general. And when you do, they very much fall into that kind of Ann Coulter over in the States, or Julia Hartlett-Brewer kind of conservative female iconoclast. So it is mainly white women. There are a small number of non-white women of color, Aisha Hazarika, who's wonderful, Afua Hirsch, and you. What do we lose when we filter current affairs through that white gaze, that predominantly white gaze? And have we lost Shola? I think we might have lost Shola. Until she comes back.
We can keep going.
Yeah, exactly. Well, first of all, I realize that I have enjoyed my moderator privilege far too much, and therefore not told our audience not asked our audience to please send in any questions they may have. I promise I will ask some questions that are not my own. But until we go back to Shola, I just want to go back again to this point about when it comes to foreign correspondence, why it is so important that we have a diversified gaze. You in the piece that you authored made a really good point about the issues around in China, for instance, that a lot of white correspondents come in with that perspective, not even just of being white, but that perspective of being a majority, and believe the perspective of the government that this is a very homogenous Han majority country. And often it is journalists like you and I think Danny from the BBC, was it, who spoke to, who are the ones who kind of look around you and think, well, there have to be minorities here because I'm a minority where I am and there are minorities everywhere.
Absolutely. So it's important. When I grew up in England, and when I was born, I think the census showed that I think it was 5% of the population was non-white in 71, something like that, right? By 1990, I think, or the 91 census, I think it was only 10%, right? Or even back in 81, in the 81 census in the UK, it's less than 10%, it's something like 8%. And nobody would have, even in 81, would say that the UK is a homogenous population, right? Even in 81, especially with the Brixton riots and what have you, right? And everybody knew that there was multiculturalism in 81 when you had a population of a BAME, or a non-white population rather, of less than 10%, right? And so going to China rather, people would say how homogenous the population is and how, you know, even if there are these pockets of ethnic minorities and problems in Western China or wherever, you know, it's still really a homogenous population. Being a minority, you know, that just can't, you just instinctively know that can't be true. Now, for horrible reasons, the issues with regards to different ethnic minorities in China in the last year, maybe two, have come to the fore. But I've been there I first went to China in 2015 when my wife got posted there for the UN. And so I first visited China then. And even back then, you're like, this can't be, it doesn't make any sense, you know? But it's lots of different ways in which you realize that you relate to power. The experience that I've had in the UK with regards to the police as a black man means that the credibility that I give to any police sources, due to my lived experience, is going to be different from the credibility that somebody else who's had nothing but good experiences with the police coming from the UK or coming from America or coming from another country is going to have, right? And so it's, how do we interpret power? How much do we trust certain institutions? You know, who do we give credibility to? And those kind of values come from our lived experiences. You know, I like to give the example with regards to having a child, right? And I'm sure people who are listening who are wheelchair users or will be able to say, this is my experience, and what I'm going to say is relatively minor. But I could have lived in a city all my life, and then the minute you have a child and you have to push a pushchair, right? You just view the world and view the city that you thought you knew completely differently.
Yeah.
Right? You just realize issues of accessibility. You just see it, you just see it differently.
Yeah. Yes.
Right? And I think lots of people can relate to that. And exactly that doesn't mean that your views of impartiality and your views of objectivity have changed, right? But it does mean that the way you view the world is different.
Yeah.
In exactly the same way, right? Whether it's due to gender, whether it's due to race, whatever it is, you're going to view the world differently. So if you have a disproportionate number of white men going around the world, it's like the equivalent of people going around the world who've never pushed a pushchair. The cities that they visit, they are going to view them differently. If you give all of those white men a pushchair that they have to push everywhere when they go to work, or every story that they have to tell, they're going to view the city differently. So just see it like that, because as I said, it's just about our perspective. It's about our lived perspective of how we view the world differently.
Shola, you've returned to us. Obviously, Marcus and I have kept the conversation going in your absence, but let me throw back to you. The question I wanted to ask you was, similarly, as one of the few non-white women who is in that space commenting on politics, which is a pretty rough and tumble space anyway, without being a woman of color. There is a resentment of women taking up space within that context anyway. Why is it so important for you to continue to kind of go back out there every day and ensure that this commentary, this perspective of current affairs isn't filtered through that majority white gaze?
I think it's always important to understand what and who you represent, especially from an intersectional perspective. So I always feel that whenever I'm on any platform, it doesn't matter what network, it's always important to bring I think the best way to describe it is this: there's so many things that shape our understanding, shape our interpretation of events, of facts. And anytime you get an opportunity to engage or give an opinion or give a report on something, you're actually bringing to bear all of those things that have helped shape who you are today, in how you report the content of your report, in how you debate. And one of the things that I've recognized is, and my husband will probably be the first to tell you, is I think it's always important to recognize what your passion is and bring that to the table. Now, the way I debate and the way I engage in debate will be very different from the way somebody else debates, right? There's no right or wrong way of it. And I recognize that being a Black woman, I get a lot of these, ooh, look at the way she's talking. Isn't she be aggressive? Isn't she be, I'm like, people, I'm not being aggressive. I'm being assertive.
You'd know if I was being aggressive.
No, you don't pass that. The thing is, you want to show your aggression, where's my wrapper? Let's take it outside. And I'm happy to teach you aggression. But it's also understanding that we have to deal with a lot of this negative perception about words we use, how we communicate, our body language, even our names, just how we are perceived before we even open our mouths, which is why I think that it is important for every single one of us, every Black person, ethnic minority, to continue to own the space that we own. So when I hear this thing about, oh, we're creating spaces for Black people, I'm like, you didn't create any space for me. You didn't create Jack all for me. That space was always mine. Those spaces were always ours. The difference is we're becoming more vocal as Black people and ethnic minorities to own those spaces, to sit in those spaces and say, actually, yeah, I've always belonged here. I always give this example that, look, my parents are Nigerian. I'm Nigerian, I'm British. And I wasn't brought up to ever think that somebody else was better than me. So I'll give you this example. When I walk into a room, honest to God, my first thought is never, oh, I'm the only Black person in this room. It doesn't even cross my mind. The way I'm brought up, when I walk into a room, the first thought is Shola has arrived. That's my first thought. That's all you all need to know.
Okay, be more Shola. That's what should that be like the first commandment for all of us walking into rooms? Celebrate yourself as you walk into the room.
It doesn't mean it does, whatever it is that gets you going, whatever it is that makes you true to yourself, I think work with that. But it doesn't mean that you don't then recognize any negative tropes or stereotype when it's thrown at you. It's just that you're not walking around with some chip on your shoulder. You walk into a room, you're engaging with people because you're comfortable in your own skin and you're comfortable with your own content. So to me, whether you're a broadcaster, a journalist, a lawyer, a politician, that should be your first bet, because everything else around you does not really reflect you as a Black person or as an ethnic minority. Again, I get it. I am more than the color of my skin, but we live in a world that defines us, first of all, by the color of our skin. So it's almost our responsibility, not even almost, it is our responsibility to continually change that narrative. So in whichever platform, I always feel very strongly, it doesn't matter what they're going to say about it, because you know they're going to say it anyway, right?
Yeah.
They're going to be like, ooh, that loudmouth has come. I got this tweet today. I mean, I get lots of them. Well, thank God my husband changed the channel before Shola came on. She's always talked, she's such a loudmouth. I don't blame you. It is true. When I came out of my mother, I was rubbish shouting. I have no doubt about that. Screaming at walls here, I'm here now, you gotta take me.
I now feel sorry for your mother, actually. That sounded quite an entrance. We have some questions, so I'm gonna try not to be selfish and enjoy myself too much and actually ask you some questions. I'm gonna actually combine two of the questions we received, because it is actually along the lines of something I was really interested in. It does feel like post the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement that we are finally seeing so much more color. In the magazines, on television, there is a very concerted and obvious effort to be more diverse, if not inclusive. And Marcus, I recognize the point that you make, that there is a difference. So firstly, what do you think about the programs? I just want to make sure I get the question right. The programs that the industry is running at the moment, whether it's employers, media, NGOs, in terms of diversity and inclusion, where are the areas for improvement? And as another attendee asks, how would you like to see media policy and practice changed in addition to these programs? So I'll go first to Shola, because we lost you for a bit. We'll give you a little bit more time.
I think this feeds back to what you were talking about before I dropped off, when you were when you gave the examples of the Emmys, right? And how funding, there's all of a sudden funding to do certain programs that would not have been done last year or 2 years ago. All of a sudden, it's a good idea now. All of a sudden, it's a priority now. I think we must recognize that we live in a very imperfect world, okay? And 2020 has shone a light on structural racism in a way that decades ago, years ago, people weren't paying attention. So as much as I welcome the fact that there's more platform being given for Black creatives, Asian creatives, right? I think it is important for us to be very careful. Again, Black creatives or Asian creatives are not necessarily going to want to write a drama or a program about racism, but they're going to want to be able to do something. They want to be able to platform incredible creation that you not have thought of, because you did not fund it before. I mean, look at the brilliant, what's the brilliant drama done by Michaela Cole. I watched it. The name just,
I May Destroy You.
Oh,
Yes.
Knocked out of the park. I'm like, whoa, brilliant piece of work, brilliant. And the acting is superb, right? And she brought there was the African, the British, all of that. I learned things I had no idea about, right? Those were, to Marcus's point, different perspectives that came into it. So as much as I welcome all of these programs, and I think it's important for us to have them, I think we must be careful about about the selection process. We need to be aware that in a lot of these cases as well, whiteness is still being centered. So Nima, to your point around the Emmys and how you notice how many more white people were getting the awards, things like that. I think what you find is, after the whole BAFTA So White and Oscar So White scandal, what I am seeing is
when an award goes to a Black or Asian ethnic minority person, think about what category they're being given that award for. To me, it's always, oh yeah, what's trending right now? Oh, is it Black Lives? Oh yeah, okay, let's do something around Black Lives. It's still almost as though we still need to engage with the subconscious thinking, systemic thinking around what is truly diverse and what inclusion means. And that means not centering whiteness in diversity and inclusion initiatives.
Absolutely. And also recognizing, I think, and this is something I definitely feel, that there is a tax that those of us who speak out in our newsrooms or in our communities or in our corporations, even just the act of having to kind of go, okay, I need to say something again. It is a tax that is not levied on our white colleagues. And so just to recognize and make space for that. And we had a colleague who eventually was like, you know, went to HR and said, please stop including me in these conversations because I'm not being paid to be your race consultant. And so many people took it badly. And I immediately thought to myself, yes, because the time that she is spending responding to you is time that her white colleagues are not. And so it's time that's coming out of her ability, her resilience. But Marcus, what would you like to see? So, and there's an excellent question from Rohit, Rohit, if you could prepare yourself to actually answer that question live, ask that question live, because we love Rohit, that would be wonderful. But just message me if you want to put your hand up and ask that live. Otherwise, I will ask it. I'm sorry, Marcus, what would you like to see?
I love a lot of the programming that's been coming out. Subsequent and has been commissioned since Black Lives Matter. And let's be honest, a lot of the programming that was commissioned before Black Lives Matter. So all the stuff that you see with regards to Steve McQueen did for the BBC with Small Axe, that was commissioned in 2019, you know, and I suspect that, I don't know when the Michaela Cole was commissioned, but I suspect that that was also commissioned because drama takes a long time. And so we can look at some brilliant examples on the BBC, on Channel 4, on CNN, of absolutely brilliant inclusive stuff, right? Having said that, so there is some really good stuff, right? And some of that stuff has actually increased because of Black Lives Matter. Having said that, right, I tweeted today because there was a picture of the team that did the BBC's US political coverage, right? It was obviously wasn't the complete team. It was only 5 people. It had the head of news, it had Andrew Neil, it had a producer, I think it had another presenter. It was only 5 of them, so as I said, it can't be the complete team, but it was 5 people, and they were all white, right? And so what you had is that race was supposedly was the second most important electoral issue in the US election. The economy was first, COVID-19 came third, so race topped COVID-19. And yet what you had, right, even in these post Black Lives Matter times, what you had is that the team that was deciding what was important when it came to the coverage of the US election were all white, right? Again, and I'm only mentioning BBC because BBC is in many ways is more open and more transparent than other broadcasters. But I would be shocked if what I'm about to say doesn't also apply to the other public service broadcasters and doesn't apply to Sky and doesn't apply to CNN as well. And, you know, everyone in Al Jazeera even, right? But what you have is the people who are making the editorial decisions are still predominantly, overwhelmingly white. And that's being kind, because a lot of the time it's exclusively white, right? And so what you have is, so for example, for the BBC, you have Fran Unsworth, you have Tim Davie, you have Bob, you have David Jordan, right? These are all white people who decide, who are at the very top level, right, of deciding what the editorial priorities and even how to interpret the editorial guidelines which they just renewed. Now, people could turn and say, you've got June Sarpong, right? And June is really good, but even she has tweeted out when the BBC had its N-word fiasco, right? she tweeted out and quite publicly said that news does not come under her remit, right? And so the most senior Black person in the BBC has no, according to her, right? I'm sure informally they must speak to her. I'm sure they do, right? Because, you know, if anyone who knows June knows that she is a powerful woman that I'm sure does not shrink away from a challenge, right? But even she has publicly said that the editorial priorities of news, right, and those editorial decisions, she has no influence, officially has no influence over, right? And so when you say so much has changed since Black Lives Matter and what have you, yes, and we need to applaud the programs which have been commissioned, but we also need to look at the power dynamics. Who are the people in positions of editorial control? And as far as I can see, and maybe you can say, well, those aren't going to change in 8 months, 9 months. And that's, you know, with regards to Black Lives Matter. And that might be a valid point. And if we do take that perspective, that's fine. But then what we need to do is say, let's make sure that we don't lose sight of what we really need to concentrate on, which are the different power dynamics, and who actually has editorial control. So let's applaud the different programs, but let's not lose sight of what also fundamentally and structurally needs to change.
Absolutely. So I'm going to try and hit allow to talk for Rohit. Rohit, can you? Hello.
How are you doing?
Lovely. So for those who don't know, Rohit Katru is a star at ITV. He's an amazing correspondent. He won Specialist Journalist of the Year at the RTS. It feels very, very long ago, Rohit. But please ask your question. I think it's a great question to Marcus and Shola.
Well, thanks for the. I mean, this has been such an interesting debate so far. Nima is obviously fantastic and brilliant. Well, and doesn't mention she won the slightly bigger award at that award ceremony.
I thought you would. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Marcus, likewise, and I follow you on Twitter. And Shola, I really enjoy your exchanges with Piers Morgan in the morning. What I would like to ask you all, you all make such an interesting and important point, which about the breadth of this issue. So much of what newsrooms are focusing on now in terms of inclusion and diversity relates specifically to stories about race post Black Lives Matter. And actually the point you tweeted about, Marcus, about the US election was quite an illuminating one when you watch all the coverage. The problem is, though, when you have that discussion, when many Black journalists and Asian journalists have that discussion with newsroom managers, I suspect the difficulty they face is recognizing the problem, the issue that Black people might see the earthquake in Germany that you, this hypothetical earthquake in Germany that you mentioned through different eyes, requires an admission that our news values are shaped subjectively. And many people go through their journalism careers just thinking that, well, that story is simply more important or it's simply more interesting. I mean, how can journalists in the newsrooms across our industry have that debate in a way where, because in a sense, the broader white prism argument is more difficult to have than going up to a boss and saying, well, you know, I'm a Black journalist, I should be talking about this story on race. I mean, this really gets to the sort of fundamental question about the way we see stories. And in a sense, it's probably much more difficult for journalists to have, particularly junior journalists. I mean, I wonder what your reflections are on that issue, and whether you can see examples where this has been challenged in certain newsrooms and actually changed.
And actually, Rohit, can I just add on to your question, because it dovetails nicely with a question that we have from an attendee who says that she became the first Muslim woman of color to become an assistant editor in the BBC's global TV newsroom ever, which is pretty horrifying. She says, it took me a long time because I never wanted to compromise on my identity, which inevitably informs my journalism. So similarly to that white gaze question that you are asking, Rohit. And so she would like to know, how do we break down that dominance and actually ask, you know, how many white editors would have thought to participate in something like this Zoom, for example? So Rohit's question, but with that slightly broader framing from our colleague in the BBC Global TV newsroom.
I'll give it a go. So to the first question, the first thing that comes to my mind is, how persuasive can you be? So there are a lot of things that are going on with that question, right? So much to unpick. So yes, we are people of color. So whether you're Black or Asian, and you may have a different background, faith, you know, all of these things that are protected characteristics, which we know are usually also subject to some form of discrimination. And especially in the workplace, where you know you have a trajectory that you're trying to build your career. You're trying to build your career substantively this way and this way. Sorry, you can't see my hands going that way, but I always say, how persuasive can you be? Because to your point to your point in reference to what Marcus said about perspectives, if you have a perspective that gives you a subjective passion about a particular story, you know that's what you're going to take to the editorial board, right? And you're going to build your argument. You're going to be as persuasive as you can. Look, as a lawyer, I always say that it's not the best lawyer that wins in court. It's the lawyer with the best argument, with the most persuasive position. So that's the first thing, because you're absolutely right. I don't think that every Black or Asian, reporter out there, or whether it's a Christian or Muslim reporter, wants to be pigeonholed into certain stories that are just about, about faith or about Black people, about racism. We don't want, because there's so much more to what we can do, right? So it's always, I always think that in any kind of circumstance, where the opportunity arises, whether you see that you have that idea for us or somebody else, and I hope I'm not telling you, I'm sure I'm telling you something you already know, but I think it always boils down to being confident enough. And confidence for me is not a feeling, it's just stepping out and doing what you know you need to do, even though you've got butterflies at the bottom of your belly, right? That for me is confidence, just stepping out there when all you want to do is, oh my God. Building your argument and say, you may not have thought of this, but this is what we want to do. Because then that subjective passion you have about that particular story, it comes through. And that's the angle. That's a Black person saying this. That's an Asian person saying this. But you're bringing a perspective, and if you are successful in being persuasive, then you will be the face of that story. You'll be the face of that report. That's the way I can see it. If not, we end up being pigeonholed into, again, what the structure, as we know, which centers again on whiteness, thinks that we are best positioned to do. And that's not what we want to do.
Marcus, before you answer, I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to Mary Dejevsky, who says, you are right about BBC US election coverage, but wrong about others. Both Sky and Channel 4 seem to have made a big effort to have much more diverse teams. But as I understood it, Marcus, your point was in the editorial decision chain higher up. That's where the diversity was lacking. So it's easy to have diversity on camera, and actually CNN was incredibly diverse on camera. But who are the people making the editorial decisions, correct? And also, of course, answering Rohit and our colleague's question.
That's definitely the point that I'm making with regards to who's making those editorial decisions. Taking nothing away from the great on-screen journalists and reporters, but you invariably find that's the first thing to change. But it's actually the editorial decision makers. But if I'm wrong, and Channel 4 and other news outlets have got people of color in editorial decision making, that's brilliant. I'm not here to be the beat up the PSBs or beat up the broadcasters for not having enough Black people behind the camera. If they do, that's brilliant. Now, then we say, well, what is the perspective? What's the diversity of disabled people behind the camera? We need to make sure that we champion all forms of diversity and all forms of perspectives to make sure that, as I said, I suspect And from the anecdotal evidence, that it's still massively and sometimes even exclusively white who are people in positions of editorial control, you know. But if I'm wrong, that's great, and I'd love to hear those examples of where I am.
Well, I can tell you with CNN, you were not wrong. We don't have many non-white people editorially up the chain making those decisions, and I think that's a very valid point. And then to Rohit's point, and to our colleague from the BBC's point about being able to kind of change that perspective of the white gaze, Shola answered from a kind of individually, what can you do? But I'm really interested kind of institutionally, what should the institution be doing to allow people to be able to come forward in that way?
Okay, I think the questions are excellent, and I think the answers is that there's not one silver bullet, there's not one answer as to how we actually solve this problem, because it is a gigantic structural problem, right? And so, for example, if I talk about Scotland, one of the ways in which the BBC started to address that is by making sure that it gave money, which is program hours, and is basically means editorial power, because money translates into that if you actually have control of your program budgets. And they placed commissioners and money in Scotland, right? And so that meant that people from a Scottish perspective were not, and people in Scotland were not having to go to people in London all the time to say, I think this is a good story. And then having to, even as forthright as they might be, as Shola has mentioned, having to make the argument. They were talking, it was one Scottish person talking to another Scottish person, right? And so the BBC had structurally changed where its money was, how it was commissioning. That's why it's so important when the BBC then moved BBC Breakfast to Manchester. You know, and actually physically, if it wanted regionality, right, so it wanted to increase regional diversity and regional perspectives, they realized it wasn't enough to tell people in London, you should kind of like Mancunians a bit more, you need to like Welsh people a bit more, let me send you on a diversity training course so that you don't have subconscious bias or unconscious bias towards Scottish people. No, they didn't realize, they realized it was a structural issue, and so they actually changed the way that BBC was structured in exactly the same way to increase regional diversity and regional perspectives. Like Channel 4 has had to physically place money and place commissioners in different places. It's had to change its structures. And so in exactly the same way, right, if we're trying to change the white gaze of newsrooms, we have to look at how we address things structurally within organizations. We also have to look at how do we change things structurally in the industry. And so we've got to realize that news, BBC, Channel 4, CNN, right, they are not the only news organizations, right, and they are working within a news environment. And so if we have a news environment in which the Voice newspaper or Eastern Eye or other news organizations that are predominantly Black or Asian can flourish, they also shape the news agenda. So Eastern Eye did a really good piece with regards to racism at the BBC, you know, and because they are, if we don't have that news organization, Eastern Eye, then that might not be on the agenda. In exactly the same way, it's no coincidence that when you had Black people, Black journalists taking part in the Downing Street COVID-19 press conference, they asked different questions. Interestingly, at least one of those Black journalists came from the Voice newspaper. So what's interesting is that the BBC and Facebook, I think, right, and the government recognizes how important it is for regional newspapers and local newspapers to thrive, right? And they've actually put in money, right, to make sure that they do thrive. And we're constantly looking at ways, because if they do not survive, if those independent or local newspapers don't survive, it then lessens our entire news ecosystem. Similarly, we need to find a way to make sure that independent Black journalism and independent Asian journalism thrives.
Yeah.
Right? Because that will then also shape the larger organizations as well. So to answer Rohit's question, there is no easy answer. I can't tell you what to do tomorrow morning when you walk into the newsroom, right? But we do have to look at how we actually change the structures. One other real quick point, sorry, I'm going on, but one other real quick point is that I don't really have the confidence of Shola, if I'm being honest. So for example, I really don't. And I'll give you a quick example to illustrate how I don't have that confidence, right? And a lot of us don't. So for example, when I tweeted out, and it was just a tweet, tweets are ephemeral, but when I tweeted out the picture of the BBC's political coverage, right, of that production team, right, I very consciously, I did one tweet real quickly, and then 2 minutes later I deleted it, right, because I did one tweet, pointed out saying, look at the all-white newsroom, or the news team for this production, right? I then deleted it. I then retweeted it, and I mentioned the fact that, look at this example. I'll be discussing it on at the Frontline Club. Now I mentioned that because if I hadn't mentioned that, then by using the legitimacy and the authority and the credibility that the Frontline Club has, right? It wasn't one Black man has gone on a Black rant as to how he wants more Black people, right? What I've done very consciously is I've centered it. This is how frightened I am. Even now, I have centered it still around an institution, or have drawn on the credibility of an institution which I know white people, right, and the people in authority respect. I then, because I realized how not toxic, how inflammatory talking about race can be, I then had to use the example of, imagine if this had been a newsroom where it was all men, right, reporting on the Clinton Trump, when Trump had been talking about grabbing Hillary Clinton, when Trump had been talking about grabbing women, and we had the possibility of the first woman president, right? And so I brought in gender as well, because I know that often gender is easier for people to talk about than race. So even in a tweet, right, I don't have the confidence, let alone walking into a room. Even in a tweet, I don't have the confidence of Shola. What I'm having to do is draw parallels which might be more acceptable with regards to gender, and I'm having to draw on the credibility of allyship of organizations which I know my white peers respect, right? Yeah. Now think about that I'm having to that's with a tweet.
Marcus, that right there, that is confidence. That's not just confidence, it's clever.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
Shola's being a lawyer now. But no, I think it's incredibly ironic, because everybody thinks that somehow when we have these conversations about race, that they're wonderful and they're great for our careers. And why are you talking? It is horrible. It is horrible because, you know, women and minorities, and that means, you know, gay, lesbian, transgender people, diverse, you know, disability activists, those of us who are in the minority are the only people whose own narration of our, you know, lived experience is challenged as inobjective. That's why you needed that video of George Floyd. We are the only people who are not believed when we say, I'm the arbiter of what I found racist, and that was racist. And then people pop up and go, oh, he's not a racist. He may not have meant to be a racist, but the thing that he said in that moment was a racist thing. And it fascinates me, because if I told you that somebody hurt my feelings, you would believe me, because I am an objective arbiter. I'm the arbiter of whether my feelings are hurt or not. So I absolutely, you know, I applaud you, Marcus, for doing it anyway. We're running out of time. So I just want to make one quick point back to Mary. Thank you for engaging with us so much, Mary. She has said, someone asked how many white editors are participating in the Zoom. She says it's a good question, but how many were invited? And I feel like that comes back to the point that Marcus, you were just making. This is the Frontline Club. You don't invite people. People come in droves to hear what is said here. And if people cared about this issue and they were a white editor and they had an awareness of wanting to hear about it in their newsroom, then they would have come. And you know, we can't constantly be opening the door and ringing bells and sending engraved cards of invitations for people to engage with us on this topic. It is an important topic and people should engage independently in and of themselves. You can't constantly be asking the, you know, the victims in this situation, those on the receiving end, to be doing the work. And that's what we, you know, people like Marcus and Shola, this is not my job. This is something I have willingly done. But for Marcus and Shola, they are willingly engaging. And so there's an excellent question from Marie Stapleton. And Shola, you first, then Marcus, then me. And then unfortunately we're out of time, which is, how much do you find you've had to align to a stereotype to get further in the industry, to then try and make a difference when you are given more of a voice? And I think that is an excellent question. Shola.
If I'm perfectly honest, I don't try to align to stereotype, because the stereotype is already aligned to me without me, you know what I mean?
Yes,
without
I know exactly what you mean.
The moment I open my mouth, it is the angry Black woman, it's the strong Black woman, it's all of those, you know, the moment I open I don't even need to, even when I speak softly, apparently I'm being a bully, I'm being dominant. I'm like, people, don't try me today, I'll take my rap out. I think that the point is this, it goes back to the first point I made about authenticity. And the reason why I that for me is really a strong point is because when the naysayers come, it is your authenticity that holds you strong, right? So for me, and this is also goes to what Marcus was saying earlier, anytime we have to broach a subject that we know will attract some kind of negative reception, you almost have to hold yourself, like, get ready, it's coming. It's going to come from different directions, it's okay. And as a woman of faith, which I am, I always have to remember who I am in God. So when people come at me with things that I know I don't represent me, it's like water off a duck's back, right? It is so important to understand that those stereotypes will come anyway. Those who are going to like you will like you. Those who are not going to like you, they were never going to like you. So it is so important that your authenticity, the opinion or the story, the experience, your skill sets that you're demonstrating, you need to bring it, you need to bring your A game every single day. That's what I find with people of color. There's no, oh, you know what, on Monday we get to relax. There's nothing like that. And it's when people also say to Black women, well, actually, what have you experienced today? And I'm looking at them, you don't understand. It is not, well, Monday it was sexism. It was definitely misogyny, and Wednesday was, yes, racism. That's not how it works. It's multiple intersecting inequalities. And you have to understand that there are going to be people who don't experience that, who don't see that, but you do. And it's not your job to educate them on that. Because if you spend time educating them on it, you are not going to progress. They need to catch up with you. And you know, to Nima's point about people waiting to be invited, let them ask questions so that you can educate them. But you see, you have to fight the good fight. And the battlefield is right in front of you. You better keep walking, and let the world catch up with you. So I would say your authenticity in all of this, whatever your background, your beliefs are, whatever holds you strong, that is what you must stand on. Whatever may come your way, you need to be that house built from bricks, from stones. When the storm comes, nothing, nada shakes you.
I love that, because someone asked for inspiring words for people of color thriving in these, seeking to thrive in these environments. Michelle Moore, I feel like Shola answered that one for you. I love it. Marcus.
I'm really bad at those kind of inspirational things. And so yeah, every time I listen to Shola, I always inspirational. So that's great. To answer the question, it's really hard. in terms of, you know, there have been books, whether you're looking at Black Skin, White Mask by Frantz Fanon, whether you look at W.B. Du Bois with regards to, you know, us having to live in two worlds. You know, it's an ongoing problem, and it's one that we have to recognize constantly. And so the only way that we can do it is by, one, talking to each other, supporting each other. You know, it's me talking to Shola, it's me talking to you, Nima. It's recognizing the hardship and the struggles that we go through, because we need to support each other, or else there is a reason why Black people suffer from mental health issues more so than other groups. And it's also about allyship as well. You know, it's recognizing, it's great that the Frontline Club has put on this talk, and it's recognizing that we can support each other and should support each other. You know, it's important that when I'm discussing these issues, that I also talk about the fact that we need to look at perspectives from disability, that we need to look at perspectives from the trans community and, you know, other marginalized groups, you know, because if I'm expecting allyship, I need to give allyship, you know. And just to really briefly answer, you know, to directly answer the question of how much do you have to fit stereotypes, which might not be stereotypes per se. Maybe I think the question, I would interpret the question to mean, how long do you have to stay relatively quiet to get on? You may have to stay quiet sometimes. You can't go into every single editorial meeting and espouse your editorial view. Nobody can. What a white man can't. All right.
They try though.
They do try a lot of the time, or they do. Right. But it's about just recognizing, you know, that you still stay true to yourself. Even if you're being quiet, you're trying to stay true to yourself, you know, because the bigger problem is that we get culturalized. And so that when we do finally reach positions of editorial control, of editorial power, it almost makes no difference, you know, because we have taken on the news values of that organization, because we've been in that ecosystem and in that news organization for the last 10, 20, 30 years, right? And so it's just trying to stay true to ourselves, even when we are quiet and even when we're just stooping to conquer. It's trying to stay true to yourself.
I mean, that's such a great point.
That was inspiring.
That was inspiring, Marcus. You sell yourself short. Can I just, I owe Mary an apology, because I'm so sorry, Mary, because when she meant participating, she meant on the panel. I'm very sorry, Mary. That was my bad. I love your point about staying true to yourself. I think my answer to that question would be that in a way I was both very lucky and very unlucky, in that nobody like me existed within that context. As a Muslim, Arabic speaking, Afro-Arab, Sudanese woman, someone like me when I started out really was not in front of camera. We were what was, you know, impolitely referred to as fixers. You know, we didn't belong in front of the camera. We were the ones who informed the storytelling of the people who were in front of the camera. So in a way that was really useful, because it meant that there was, I know a lot of my white female friends and colleagues who hew much closer to the stereotype of, you know, a woman on network news, especially on a US network, very much felt that pressure and that stereotype, to the extent of even how they looked. You know, you have a baby, you drop the weight immediately. If you don't drop the weight, that perception of people judging and staring at you, I think luckily for me, didn't exist. So I was able to be me. But it also meant that often I was not treated as being a correspondent. So when we were covering the Chibok girls, we had actually already gone to Maiduguri and come back, and a BBC crew who were based in Maiduguri came across us, and wearing their abaya in the north of Nigeria, because it was under Sharia law at the time, with my Kenyan producer and my Rwandese cameraman, somebody asked me, a very famous BBC journalist asked me where the toilets were. He could not compute that I could possibly be leading another team. He could not compute that we might have already kicked his ass and gone and gotten the story, and we're on our way back. And so he spent an embarrassing few days talking about being the only team in the northeast of Nigeria until we got back to Abuja and released our story. I'll let everyone guess who that was. But, you know, in a lot of ways, it was incredibly demoralizing, because that support, that companionship that you talk about, that is so important when you're in those places, I very often did not feel. I very often didn't feel that sense of, oh, we're all here hiding behind the barricades together. Mainly because I recognized and saw myself in the people who were being bombarded rather than the people who were flying in. So when we were covering Tahrir Square, and I actually came towards the end, and the Reporters Sans Frontières released a whole story about how maybe female correspondents shouldn't be there after the appalling rape of Lara Logan. It was extraordinary to me because, of course, female correspondents were there. The Egyptian female journalists who had been risking their lives before the rest of us got there and would continue to risk their lives when we all left, were there. And so I think in some ways not having that stereotype was really helpful, but in other ways it probably was quite damaging, because although it allowed me to continue to kind of maintain that authenticity of voice that you both rightly speak about as being important, it also meant that I never really saw myself within that broader cohort of the comrades that were there. And who knows, maybe my journalism has benefited from that. But within a newsroom context, that idea of I'm going to stay quiet and stay true to myself is something that I still grapple with at the age of 42, this belief that somehow you say what you need to say, you say what you can say. And I say that to a lot of the younger girls and women, the younger colleagues coming up the ranks, that you have no pressure to say anything more than you can say. Nobody wants you to throw away your career if you are not there. But also for me, I have realized that I've been chasing after a mirage, which is the miraculous point where I have enough of a voice and enough, Marcus is shaking his head because he knows what I'm going to say, where I have enough of a voice and enough of a platform that people welcome what I'm about to say. And that point never arrives. Nobody ever wants to be told. Somebody internally said to me this summer, you know, this manager showed you his new baby and you told him the baby was ugly. That's how he felt about your comments on our diversity policy. And I felt like that was, maybe I told him his baby would maybe need braces. I hadn't necessarily said the baby was ugly. I'd said, try harder with your baby, maybe a few more bright colors. I don't know, this isn't working. And I think that's often the mirage that we chase as minorities, that someday my voice is going to be acceptable. And I don't know that that day ever comes. And only you can know what you're willing to risk. And sometimes you have to decide, and this is no hyperbole, I truly believe this is about who I am. This is about my soul. Can my soul survive the censorship and the biting of the tongue anymore? Am I willing to risk everything that I've built up? And sometimes, unfortunately, the answer is you have to take that risk. We are at 8:18. I'm so sad. We've actually run over. Honestly, this has been such a pleasure, and I've loved all of the contributions, all of the questions. I'm so grateful for everyone who has listened in, who has been so engaged. I'm incredibly grateful to Shola and Marcus and to lovely Pranvera Smith at the Frontline Club who kind of hatched this plan. In fact, this was her idea to try and do this. And I'm really grateful for the platform. And I feel like when lockdown finishes, or even before lockdown, maybe we need to try this again, or at the very least a cup of tea and a Zoom. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so have a wonderful night. Stay safe.
That was fun.
Thank you
for having me. Good to see you guys.
No, thank you so much.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Oh, bless you. I'm so glad. The last thing I wanted to do in your Kuala Lumpur hotel room is to make life any more difficult for you, Mark.
Come to Kuala Lumpur after COVID. Come. It's great here.
Okay, we'll see. Was that an open invitation to
That's all
50-something
participants? Yeah, come.
Love it.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.